Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today, I continue to bring you the story of Ly Hoai Ca and Hùng, carrying forward the emotions that were left unfinished in the previous episode. In the last part, Hoai Ca went through her pregnancy filled with anxiety, caught between fear and love. It was not only the journey of a woman about to become a mother, but also a series of days in which she learned, little by little, how to become stronger. From the moment the two red lines appeared on the test strip, Hoai Ca's heart seemed to freeze for a second. She stood still in the bathroom, her hands trembling, her mind completely blank, until a rush of emotions came flooding in, impossible to stop. The months that followed passed slowly, heavy with worry. Every time she felt exhausted, every time she feared for the tiny life growing inside her, Hoai Ca reminded herself to keep going. There were nights when she lay facing the wall, gently placing a hand on her belly, whispering words meant only for herself and her baby. And through all those moments, Hùng was always there, quiet but steady, holding her hand tightly, like a promise that didn't need to be spoken. When the day came to enter the hospital, all emotions seemed to compress into a single, shallow breath. Outside the delivery room, Hùng held Hoai Ca's hand firmly. His hand was warm and strong, as if passing an invisible source of strength to her. Hoai Ca looked at him without saying a word, but in her eyes was absolute trust. Tony, the little boy who spoke slowly, stood outside as well. He didn't run around or ask questions. He simply stood still, his small hands clutching the hem of his shirt, his eyes fixed on the delivery room door. Tony said nothing, yet every glance and every tiny movement held his worry and love for his mother and his soon-to-be sibling. It was as if he sensed that behind that door was something incredibly important to their family. Then the delivery room door closed. Outside was a heavy, silent wait. Inside was another journey, quiet, but filled with trials. In the delivery room, Hoai Ca lay on the bed, sweat soaking her forehead. The white lights overhead made everything feel both sharp and strangely distant. Waves of pain came without warning, at times making her feel as though she no longer had the strength to continue. Each time the pain subsided, Hoai Ca took a deep breath, forcing herself to steady her breathing just as she had been instructed. "You can do this. Breathe with me." The doctor's voice echoed calmly and patiently, like an anchor in the middle of the tension. Hoai Ca bit her lip tightly. Tears streamed down her cheeks, soaking into the pillow. She didn't cry out, she held everything in, her breaths broken and uneven. At that moment, the world around her slowly faded away, leaving only two clear images in her mind. Tony, with his innocent, clear eyes, and Hùng hand, which had been holding her so tightly just moments before. She would not allow herself to collapse. Not now. Not when there were people waiting for her outside. Time inside the delivery room moved unbearably slowly. Every minute felt endless. But then, after hours of tension that seemed to have no end, a sound rang out, tearing through the heavy air, the first cry of new life, clear, strong, and full of vitality. "It's a baby girl." Those simple words marked a turning point. In that moment, Hoai Ca burst into tears. These were no longer tears of pain, but tears of overwhelming happiness after everything she had endured. The tiny newborn was placed gently on her chest. The soft warmth against her skin made Hoai Ca tremble as she lowered her head. She looked at the little face, the rosy skin, the eyes still tightly closed. In that instant, all worries and exhaustion seemed to fall away. In a weak but love-filled voice, Hoai Ca whispered, as if speaking to her own heart. "Hello, my child. Anna." Outside the delivery room, when the sudden cry of a newborn rang out, cutting through the tension that had stretched on for hours, Hùng almost sprang to his feet by instinct. The chair beneath him shifted slightly, but he no longer noticed anything around him. A man who was always calm, rarely letting his emotions show, he could no longer hide the surge of feeling rising with every breath. His chest heaved, his heart pounding so fast he could clearly feel it himself. The delivery room door opened. Pale white light spilled into the hallway. A nurse stepped out, carrying the baby, her steps slow but steady. Hung froze, his hands instinctively clenching together. In that moment, he was so overwhelmed that he barely dared to breathe, afraid that even the slightest unnecessary movement might cause this precious instant to disappear. A baby girl, mother and child are both safe. The words were clear and simple, but to Hung, they felt like a confirmation of every worry, every hour of waiting, every emotion he had held back until now. He stepped closer, each step slow, as if moving too quickly might cause what was before him to slip away. His hands trembled as the nurse carefully placed the baby into his arms. Anna was tiny. Her small body fit perfectly in an adult's embrace, warm in a way that felt almost unreal. Her breathing was light as a breeze, softly brushing against his chest. Hung lowered his head and looked at her for a long time without blinking, as if trying to carve every delicate feature into his memory. In that moment, the entire world around him seemed to slow down, every sound, every movement fading into the background. "Hello, my little girl," he whispered, his voice hoarse, nearly breaking in his throat. Never before had Hung felt responsibility so clearly, so heavy, yet so deeply comforting. A profound, unexpected, and powerful love spread through his chest, pulsing with every heartbeat. He understood that from this moment on, his life had entered a new chapter, one where every choice and every effort would no longer be just for himself. Because Hoai Ca needed rest after giving birth, time to recover both physically and emotionally, Hung decided to take Tony to stay with his mother for a few days. The decision wasn't easy, but he knew it was necessary. Before leaving the hospital, Tony stood quietly beside his mother's bed. He didn't ask questions or cling to her. He simply stood there, his eyes fixed on Anna, who was sleeping peacefully nearby. Tony gently placed his familiar teddy bear on the bed, right next to Anna. The bear had been with him for years, old but clean, soft from being hugged every night. His movements were slow and careful, as if he were giving his sister something very important, a part of himself. Then Tony reached out and lightly touched the baby's cheek. His tiny fingertip was so gentle it barely made contact, as though he feared that even a little more pressure might wake her. In his eyes were curiosity, tenderness, and a hint of childlike awkwardness. Hoai Ca lay on the bed, watching every movement of her son. Her eyes had turned red without her noticing, her nose stinging. She called out softly, her voice still weak but carefully gentle. "Mom will come get you soon." Tony didn't reply. He simply nodded, a small but decisive motion. Then he turned and tightly grasped Hung's hand, his small fingers wrapping around the larger one, as if entrusting him with everything he couldn't put into words. Hung bent down and gently stroked Tony's hair, the familiar gesture slow and reassuring. "Dad, we'll take good care of Mom and your sister." Tony looked at him. His gaze lingered on Hung's face for a few seconds, as if trying to imprint that promise into his heart. Then he nodded once more, still silent, but with trust clearly visible in every small movement. The first days after giving birth passed slowly and heavily for Hoai Ca. Her body was still very weak. Even the smallest movement was enough to send a dull ache through her incision, spreading like a constant reminder of the difficult journey she had just endured. Each time she shifted, she had to take a deep breath, forcing her expression to remain calm so as not to worry those around her, yet the exhaustion was still evident in every breath she took. Hùng hardly left the hospital during those days. He was there from early morning until late at night, often going without sleep. A man once accustomed to work and major decisions now devoted all his attention to the smallest details. He took care of everything himself, from calling the nurse whenever Hoai Ca needed assistance, preparing warm water at just the right temperature for her to clean herself, to carefully adjusting the blankets and pillows so she could rest more comfortably. At night, when the hospital sank into silence, Hùng stayed awake. He kept watch over Hoai Ca's sleeping hours, afraid she might turn in pain without anyone by her side. At times, he simply sat on the chair beside the bed, quietly watching the mother and child, his gaze unwavering, as if blinking for even a second might cause him to miss something important. Whenever Anna cried, Hùng was always the first to pick her up. He was still awkward, his large hands clumsy as they cradled his tiny daughter. Yet that awkwardness came with an almost tense level of carefulness. He learned everything step by step, slowly and earnestly. Changing diapers, preparing milk, checking her temperature, rocking her to sleep, every task was done with intense focus, as though even the smallest mistake might make her uncomfortable. There were nights when Anna cried endlessly. Hùng walked back and forth around the room with her in his arms, his steps steady, his breathing soft, his low voice murmuring gentle lullabies. He never rushed, never grew irritated, only patiently repeating those motions, as if soothing himself into calm along with his child. Hoai Ca often woke in the middle of the night. The bedside lamp cast a gentle glow, just enough for her to clearly see Hùng sitting beside the bed. One arm held Anna close to his chest, while the other gently patted her, the rhythm steady and familiar. His face looked tired, but his eyes were soft and focused, as though his entire world at that moment was contained within that embrace. Hoai Ca watched him for a long time, her heart filling with a feeling that was both warm and aching. She spoke softly, her voice still weak and hoarse after childbirth. "Are you tired?" Hùng turned to look at her. His gaze rested on Hoai Ca's face for a few seconds, then he gently shook his head, the motion slow and resolute. "No, I'm just afraid you and the baby might be without me, even for a moment." The words were spoken quietly, without flourish, without emphasis, but they made Hoai Ca's throat tighten. She turned her face away, pretending to adjust her pillow, hiding the tears silently gathering at the corners of her eyes. In that moment, she said nothing more, letting the emotions spread quietly through her chest, heavy, yet deeply warm. The first days after giving birth passed slowly and heavily for Hoai Ca. Her body was still very weak. Even the smallest movement was enough to send a dull ache through her incision, spreading like a constant reminder of the difficult journey she had just endured. Each time she shifted, she had to take a deep breath, forcing her expression to remain calm so as not to worry those around her, yet the exhaustion was still evident in every breath she took. Hùng hardly left the hospital during those days. He was there from early morning until late at night, often going without sleep. A man once accustomed to work and major decisions now devoted all his attention to the smallest details. He took care of everything himself, from calling the nurse whenever Hoai Ca needed assistance, preparing warm water at just the right temperature for her to clean herself, to carefully adjusting the blankets and pillows so she could rest more comfortably. At night, when the hospital sank into silence, Hùng stayed awake. He kept watch over Hoai Ca's sleeping hours, afraid she might turn in pain without anyone by her side. At times, he simply sat on the chair beside the bed, quietly watching the mother and child, his gaze unwavering, as if blinking for even a second might cause him to miss something important. Whenever Anna cried, Hùng was always the first to pick her up. He was still awkward, his large hands clumsy as they cradled his tiny daughter. Yet that awkwardness came with an almost tense level of carefulness. He learned everything step by step, slowly and earnestly. Changing diapers, preparing milk, checking her temperature, rocking her to sleep, every task was done with intense focus, as though even the smallest mistake might make her uncomfortable. There were nights when Anna cried endlessly. Hùng walked back and forth around the room with her in his arms, his steps steady, his breathing soft, his low voice murmuring gentle lullabies. He never rushed, never grew irritated, only patiently repeating those motions, as if soothing himself into calm along with his child. Hoai Ca often woke in the middle of the night. The bedside lamp cast a gentle glow, just enough for her to clearly see Hùng sitting beside the bed. One arm held Anna close to his chest, while the other gently patted her, the rhythm steady and familiar. His face looked tired, but his eyes were soft and focused, as though his entire world at that moment was contained within that embrace. Hoai Ca watched him for a long time, her heart filling with a feeling that was both warm and aching. She spoke softly, her voice still weak and hoarse after childbirth. "Are you tired?" Hùng turned to look at her. His gaze rested on Hoai Ca's face for a few seconds, then he gently shook his head, the motion slow and resolute. "No, I'm just afraid you and the baby might be without me, even for a moment." The words were spoken quietly, without flourish, without emphasis, but they made Hoai Ca's throat tighten. She turned her face away, pretending to adjust her pillow, hiding the tears silently gathering at the corners of her eyes. In that moment, she said nothing more, letting the emotions spread quietly through her chest, heavy, yet deeply warm. The afternoon slowly settled in, soft sunlight slanting through the hospital window and bathing the room in a gentle golden hue. The space felt quieter than usual, filled only with the faint sounds of the hospital, the distant footsteps in the hallway, the steady rhythm of a heart monitor, and the soft breathing of a tiny life sleeping peacefully. Anna lay snug in Hoai Ca's arms. Her tiny body rested against her mother's chest, her face calm, lips slightly pursed in a serene sleep. Hoai Ca leaned back against the pillows, one arm holding her child, the other resting lightly on the thin blanket. Though her body was still tired, her eyes had softened, as if all worries had been temporarily set aside to make room for this rare sense of peace. Hùng stood nearby without a word. He simply watched the mother and child, his gaze slowly tracing each familiar line. Seeing Anna sleeping so soundly in Hoai Ca's arms, the corner of his mouth lifted into a faint smile. It wasn't a visible smile, but a small, genuine expression that appeared only when he fully let go. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about work or the days ahead, he was simply standing there, committing this image to memory. The sunlight outside gradually shifted, brushing lightly over Hoai Ca's hair before sliding down onto the blanket covering Anna. Everything moved slowly, quietly, as if time itself had chosen to soften so as not to break this fragile moment. Elsewhere, not far from the hospital, Tony sat beside his grandmother. He held his familiar teddy bear tightly in his arms, his small hands gripping it as they always did. The bear had been with him for a long time, through sleep, through waiting, and now lay still in his embrace. Tony sat obediently, not running around, not talking much. From time to time, he lifted his head to glance toward the door, his gaze lingering for a few seconds before dropping again. No one needed to ask. No one needed to explain. In those quiet glances, one could feel the silent waiting in the boy's heart, a waiting without words, yet steady and deeply real. A small family. Each person in a different place, each carrying their own emotions, yet all slowly piecing together the missing fragments of love. The pieces were not complete, not yet whole, but little by little, they were finding where they belonged. And somewhere ahead of them, that journey was still continuing. The days to come were waiting, filled with things yet to be named, yet to be fully imagined. Stay tuned for the next episode to discover how the story unfolds.
Xin chào tất cả mọi người đã quay trở lại với kênh của mình nhé. Giờ thì mình đang tạo hình ảnh này làm khô quá mọi người. Làm nail. Cũng không biết là có ổn không. Mình cứ tạo thử, mình sẽ tạo tầm vài tấm ảnh, sau đó nếu mà ok thì mình mới kiểu mình lựa mọi người. Nhiều lúc thì mình cũng nhờ ChatGPT để viết gợi ý. Cái này là câu lệnh này. Chào mọi người, hẹn gặp lại mọi người ở video sau.